Thank you everyone for coming to our lecture. So the guest of the Institute today is Professor Hans-Georg Moeller. He is a professor at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the University of Macau. He authored numerous books, including You and Your Profile, Identity After Authenticity, Genuine Pretending on the Philosophy of Zhuangzi, did I say it right? Both with Paul D. Ambrosio, and Moral Fool, A Case for Amorality, and The Radical Lumen, all with Columbia University Press. He is also a content creator on YouTube. He has two philosophy channels, Carefree Wandering and Philosophy in Motion, which is also how I came across Professor Moeller's work. So today, Professor Moeller will, through the lens of his philosophy, talk a bit about the problem of gender identity. So, Professor Moeller, the floor is yours.
I'm supposed to use this microphone. Thank you very much, Milan. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I came here to Belgrade at the beginning of the year, actually at the end of last year, for a sabbatical. And I wrote a book manuscript. It's just a short book on gender, as Milan just said. And I finished the manuscript a few weeks ago. So first of all, I'm very grateful to have this opportunity here, maybe get some feedback. Obviously, the book hasn't been published yet, and so there will still be rounds of revisions. So that's what I'm talking about, also hoping to get some feedback. Now, when I submitted the book to the publisher, she sent a link to this interview here to me. Which I want to use to start the presentation. So I only knew about this interview after I already finished the project, and the editor, I think, was very right in noticing that the interview is quite related to my project. The interview is, as you can see here on this Ezra Klein show, which is like a podcast show from the US, and it's an interview between a feminist there and Masha Gessen, who is a Russian-American journalist, also kind of activist. And if this works, just play 1.5 minutes from this interview.
Well, I think the problem is that we just assign such disproportionate importance to both sexuality and gender. And so if they're so important, if they're so central to our identities, then how could they be accidental? How could they be chosen? How could they be mutable? We need them to be cores of who we are. And for that, we have to invent all sorts of narratives about how they were always there. But the way you just told the story was so lovely. You met your wife. You could have not met your wife, right? You got really lucky. But to think that these absolutely central identity-forming things happen because you got lucky is so destabilizing to the whole way that we've constructed them.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, right? I mean, we'd like to think that there's some grand design, or lacking a grand design, at least a set of principles by which we can make sense of the world. But
what if we just agree to be playful and have fun with the one life each of us is given?
Now I'm supposed to use this. Let's see if that works. Yes. So this is actually the person who was interviewed, Masha Gessen, a non-binary person. I have to call Gessen they. I hope I'm going to manage to do that. And this was the podcast we were just listening to, an interview by Lydia Polgren of Masha Gessen. And in this more than 1 hour long interview, the core conversation, Gessen basically argues from her very progressive perspective against this kind of idea of gender essentiality. She says, which is not really a controversial point, I would say, that gender identity is culturally, socially, psychologically, bodily contingent, and also sexual orientation. And as you just heard in the clip, eventually she kind of advocates for something like a playful attitude toward gender and sexual orientation. And they, I should say, Gessen also refers, at the end they are asked about a book recommendation, and they recommend this book, The Myth of the Wrong Body, which is a myth that it often kind of features quite strongly in current debates about gender, and especially about transgender, that somehow people are born into the wrong body. And Gessen argues against that. And my book project is also trying to argue against that myth. I also did not read the book yet, so this is all information I got basically after finishing my manuscript. What I did read and rather listen to are a number of videos by one of the most famous transgender person on YouTube, Natalie Wynn. And she also makes a kind of forceful argument against gender metaphysics or gender theology. These are her words. And I think that fits nicely with what Gessen says. And also, it's the point I'm trying to make. So these are just a few quotes from Natalie Wynn's videos. So she asks herself, she's a transgender woman, right? Am I truly a woman, ontologically, neurologically, metaphysically? Responding to herself to this question, she says, well, gender definitions are just a bullshit semantics debate. This is metaphysics, and life is just too short for metaphysics. And she says, I personally don't believe in any gender metaphysics at all. I wasn't born a woman, I was born a fucking baby. So like this, she also argues against what is sometimes called feminine essence theory, which says that trans women are female souls in male bodies, and that they are essentially have been women from birth to death, who then transition to make their accidental interior match their essential interior. So she's arguing against these, again, like a myth of being born in the wrong body. Now, if there is no such thing as a gender essence, what is gender then? And again, this is like, in my terminology, the basic point of the book is that we've switched, or we moved on from gender as a gender role, which is traditional form of identifying with one's gender, to identifying with gender in the form of a profile. So the profile is my terminology, but I find the idea of gender as profile quite well expressed, perhaps better than by myself, by both Gessen and by Natalie Wynn. And here are just some more quotes from that interview. Gessen is asked, what does that tell us about the nature of identity? This is the interviewer who asks that question. And the idea that there is some sort of sovereign self that you can anchor yourself to. And then Gessen says, well, that's another problem with the whole born in the wrong body discourse. I've always felt that gender is something that happens between me and other people. It doesn't actually happen inside my body. It's what people see, what I want them to see, what I feel when they see one thing and not the other thing. All of that is my gender. And similarly, we have Natalie Wynn, or ContraPoints, that's the name of her channel, saying, it's the way you dress, it's the way you speak, it's the way you act, it's the way you relate to other people. And again, gender is also a social, structural, interpersonal. You don't become a woman the first time you put on a dress. You become a woman the first time an older female relative turns to you at a restaurant and says, maybe you should order the salad, sweetie. Or we want not necessarily to pass perfectly, but at least to seem like our genders to the people around us. As Laura Jane Grace put it, you want them to see you like they see every other girl. So again, all these quotes that I'm starting the presentation with are basically expressing what I understand as a gender identity, as a profile identity. And I'll talk more about that. Now, So I think this is what gender actually is nowadays, often is, not what it always is, not what it always has been, but how gender is, let's say, lived today in the form of a profile. But that's not how gender is actually mostly being framed in public discourse. Public discourse still very much frames gender differently, old-fashionedly, in the language and in the ideology of authenticity, of somehow being your true self. And so this is very obvious when we look, as opposed to what we just heard from a transgender person, if we look at the public kind of depiction specifically of transgender, we find this very strong emphasis on authenticity, right? So this is a popular book about transgender people in the United States called Authentic Selves, celebrating trans and non-binary people and their families. Well, this is an article, I just, there's endless sources for this. What being trans taught me about finding my authentic self. Thoughts on authenticity from a trans feminine perspective. And then if we move on, and this is, I think, very important, also to the so-called gender-affirming surgery, which is now a big market, especially in the United States. And there we find exactly the same language. If you find like the typical advertising and commercial gender-affirming procedures, it's always highlighting this kind of search for authenticity. These are at the top of the slide, you see slogans from this advertising. Your path to your true identity begins here. It's from the advertising on the left, RRT Surgical, and the other one is a different company. Our goal is to help you be authentic and true to yourself. That is the typical advertising language that you find there. And you find it also like on political, in a political sphere. Right, especially like the so-called progressive parties, like the Democratic Party in the United States. They also, of course, kind of like to depict themselves on somehow the transgender side. And again, the marketing language for this is also using the semantics of authenticity. This is like from New York City Mayor de Blasio, a campaign a few years ago. About restroom usage, bathroom usage. And again, the campaign was using this authenticity language, right? When you choose the bathroom you go to, this is kind of proof or enacting your authenticity. That is how it's presented. Use the restroom consistent with who you are, right? Use the restroom authentically. Now, and this language, again, especially in the United States, is ubiquitous. Here's another example. This is taken from a real estate brochure, also on the internet, for selling houses and stuff like this. And this is just the short text by the real estate firm. They have one of their agents is a transgender person, and it is at the occasion it was published of the Transgender Day of Remembrance, where they say it's a time for authenticity. And then the article is introduced by saying, for transgender real estate professional Jamie Zapata, leading with authenticity in both life and business is the only way to thrive. And then this article is written by Jamie Zapata, and she says, this is an interesting statement, I think, because of its paradoxicality. Being trans is no more of a choice than it is for anyone else to be who they are. Non-LGBTQ people get to decide who they are and how they want to present themselves to the world. So trans people should be afforded that same luxury. So that's obviously kind of a blatant logical contradiction, because in the first sentence, she says that it is not a choice. One's gender is not a choice. But then in the second sentence, she says that everyone should get to the same right to decide who they are. So to choose. And that's, again, a core, I think, paradox here. The very same paradox you can also see in the recent German law that was just came into law just a few weeks ago, or maybe just a week ago, about gender change. It's a long text, more than 70 pages, and I read through it, and you see the same authenticity paradox there. On the one hand, the long text justifying this law speaks about what in German is Geschlechtsempfinden, so something like a gender sense, that you have some form of sense what your gender is. And then it says that each person has this sense, and that they somehow find and recognize their essential gender, and that they can only do this by themselves. That's again authenticity. No one else can do it for them. No specialist, not other people. It's kind of a pure authentic search that you can only find your true gender within yourself. That is kind of the premise the law starts with. And then it talks about, with the same kind of paradoxical logical contradiction, about an autonomous decision on the choice of gender. So that's the same contradiction we saw in Zapata. And then it also says, and that's even more confusing, that the purpose of this new law, which enables people to change their gender entry, is that they can live in accordance with their sense gender. So that is like the old kind of gender role semantics that now comes in, that somehow every gender has a specific way of life. And if you're not really assigned that gender correctly, then the normal gender way of life is kind of closed off to you. And then, confirming this, the law text says the assignment Zuordnung zu, by others, a gender is of outstanding importance for individual identity. So typically this kind of gender assignment, the law supposes, plays a key role in a person's sense of self as well as in how this person is perceived by others. The assignment to a gender determines, so even though the law is about people determining their gender themselves, the law text now says it's essential that others, namely this law, somehow determines what their gender is, so that they are addressed because of the expectations that are in place regarding the outward appearance, the education, or the behavior of a person. Again, now it is assumed that this gender has to be assigned correctly, namely somehow by the law, and that then people are free to live in line with the expectations and so forth that are attached to that specific gender. So this is all very kind of contradictory and confusing language. Now, I think what we see here in this kind of semantics is a mixture and a confusion of what I call three different identity technologies. The first identity technology is the old identity technology of sincerity, which means that you develop a sense of self by sincere commitment, that means mentally and behaviorally, to social roles. That is the traditional way also how we build a sense of gender identity. We are assigned to a certain gender, then we sincerely commit to the roles in our behavior, in our mind, and then we form a sense of our identity by committing to that role. Now, according to my argument, this changes in Western modernity when we switch from sincerity to authenticity. In the age of authenticity, as the philosopher Charles Taylor called it, this kind of commitment to role fulfillment is replaced by the idea that you can only find the self through pursuit of originality, that you have to discover or create the true selves, right? That is the new identity technology of authenticity. Find or discover or create your true self. And of course, we saw that language as well. But now I think generally we've already switched to a third form of identity technology, which we also saw very much reflected in the quotes at the beginning from Masha Gessen and Natalie Wynn, namely prophilicity, that we build a sense of self through the curation and validation of profile. We show ourselves in certain ways, and we are seen by others, and thereby we develop some form of, in these kind of social validation feedback loops, we develop a solid sense of self. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about that. So, of course, this relates very much to gender. This is a traditional Chinese family. I always use this photo to discuss sincerity. You see this photo for me exemplifies the internalization, the sincere commitment to traditional gender roles, right? In everything, in the position you have in society, the women on the right, the men on the left, what they, how they dress and everything, and the woman also has bound feet, so also how you, let's say, discipline your body is all like a part of the sincere commitment to a specific gender role, and thereby developing a very strongly gendered sense of self, that's sincerity. Now, then authenticity and gender, for me, philosophically speaking, the main person exemplifying, let's say, the authentic approach to gender under conditions of the identity technology of authenticity, is by Simone de Beauvoir. In The Second Sex, I have here, which is for me a decisive quote, she writes, "I cannot be just to books which treat of woman as woman," right? So she basically rejects the characterization of a person based on their gender role. And then she continues, "My idea is that all of us, men as well as women, should be regarded as human beings." So you basically find your authentic self, your true self, by transcending gender roles, by going beyond conformity, beyond sincere commitment to gender roles, right? So from the authenticity perspective, as exemplified by Beauvoir, gender was seen as a social construct, creating inequality between the sexes and imposing conformity to hierarchical roles. And the very point for her, for de Beauvoir, for like gender under conditions of authenticity, was to overcome the internalization of gender roles and the hierarchies they established in order to be everyone to be original and free, right? So you basically have to get beyond gender roles and beyond gender at all to be truly authentic, right? Everyone should be regarded as human beings, as individuals. And gender is something secondary to that. Gender is something that obstructs your self-finding. Now, as I said, my argument is that we've moved beyond that, and that we're living in times of prophylicity, and that now gender is basically, in many places of the world, not everywhere, lived as profile. And of course, the word and the notion is taken from social media, where we're constantly invited, obliged to kind of identify ourselves in terms of gender, where we have to develop, curate, present gender profiles. So now, especially on social media, but not just there, it is very clear that we live gender in the form of the curation of a gendered identity. And then we are somehow hoping, or for most people it somehow succeeds, instead of building sincere commitment, we are capable of building true investment in social validation feedback loops. We present ourselves in there are myriad ways in which we can gender ourselves, and then we get positive feedback, and that is mutually reinforcing. And a wide variety of gendered identities are developing and are constantly kind of dynamically changing. And importantly, from a philosophical perspective, this is an important notion for me. This happens under second order observation. That means we're not just observing one another directly, as in traditional role relationships, for instance in the family, but we are observing also how we are observed by what I call the general peer, by like a general public, right? So we observe how gender is observed, and then we build our in society, and we develop our own curation in the context of observing how others observe. Right? So this is a basic concept of gender as a profile. Now, here are some theses on prophilic gender identity. I think at the beginning I introduced this notion of gender as profile through these quotes from Marcia Gessen, and from Natalie Wynn. The first is a non-binary person, the other person is a transgender person. But I do not think that gender as profile is something that is unique for, let's say, non-traditional genders. I think cisgender today is just as prolific as transgender. And we can see this very clearly, for instance, again, on social media or in media in general. Influencers and pop culture, whatever. Think of the Barbie movie, for instance, right? Present a plethora of still mostly cisgender profiles, right? Again, the Barbie movie would be a perfect example for that. And so the public presentation and validation of gender profiles is equally characteristic of cisgender and transgender today, right? So again, the point is we're no longer like in this authenticity mode where we try to go beyond gender, but gender has become again kind of embraced in our personal identity building, but of course, obviously not in the traditional gender role format, right? That we present ourselves as feminine doesn't necessarily mean that we, you know, want to get married and have children and have no job and always cook for our husband, right? And similarly, that we present ourselves male doesn't mean that we're like the traditional heterosexual male and so forth. So the presentation and the validation of gender profiles is nothing that is peculiar to any particular gender. This leads to the second point, everybody must get gendered. In prophilicity, where gender is now a style, this is a term again used by Natalie Wynn in one of her videos, where she kind of sums up what gender is. It's kind of a personal style of expression. No one escapes gendering, right? Because of course, if you have no style, it's also a style. So you cannot escape the gender profile. I mean, just go on, you know, social media where you have a profile and you have to gender yourself in one way or another. And if you don't do that, then that's also a form of profiling. Now, importantly, and this is again one of the main points I'm trying to make in the book, is against this, not just against the myth of being born in the wrong body and the myth of gender metaphysics and the myth of gender theology, but also this myth of the idea that gender is somehow autonomously self-determined just by the individual itself. Identity, including gender identity, is, this is the typical, I use it kind of somewhat ironically, postmodernist phrase, always already, and has always been socially conditioned. Of course, in the context of a person's biology and psychology, of their sexual orientation, and so forth. But none of this is self-determined. Gender, again, I'm quoting here Masha Gessen, gender is something that happens between me and other people. It doesn't actually happen inside my body. It's what people see, what I want them to see, what I feel when they see one thing and not the other thing. Right? This is one of the quotes I started the presentation with. So gender is never just self-determined, just as identity in general is never just self-determined. It's an ongoing project that has all these components which have to be somehow aligned with one another, the bodily components, the psychological components, and the social components. And here are a few more theses. I think that might already be the last slide. I think this tendency in public discourse to project the language of authenticity onto gender, and especially onto transgender, is not helpful at all. I think this, in my view, this kind of heavy emphasis on authenticity language when it comes to, let's say, marketing gender and especially marketing transgender in medical business, or to use it like for political purposes and so forth, that society somehow is projecting its futile attempt, its nostalgia for authenticity in times of prophilicity onto gender, and especially on transgender people. So my basic thesis is we've already moved beyond our own authenticity, and now we project this nostalgia for our authenticity onto the transgender community, which we somehow regard as, you know, an exemplary effort to, you know, sacrifice yourself, sacrifice your body in order to eventually prove and find and develop your true authenticity. I think that's a kind of a hidden, the hidden background behind this kind of, I think, completely counterfactual emphasis on authenticity when it comes to transgender. So somehow transgender community is given the contradictory task to assure ourselves that we can still continue this pursuit of authenticity in times when all of us are constantly already engaged in profile building. Now, I also think that all of these identity technologies, including profilicity, are beyond good and evil. I don't think any of them is right, and I don't think any of them is better as such than the others. They all work more or less in different social configurations. So in the traditional society, sincerity somehow works. And today, of course, in our highly digitalized world, profilicity works quite well. So profilicity reflects today's highly dynamic and medialized society, where profiles are ubiquitous. We need different profiles. We need different profiles for the job, for our intimate life, for our political life, and so forth. And we need to update our profiles constantly. For instance, as an academic or as a YouTuber, for that matter, right? So we cannot but form a valid identity today if we don't use the identity technology of profilicity. Now, that is not to say that any of these identity technologies is, let's say, ideal. All of them have their pathologies. All of them have their kind of pitfalls. Obviously, people can be over-invested in their profiles, right? You can be, you know, obsessed with, for instance, your professional profile or also your social media profiles. And of course, this is also how whatever the providers of apps they try to make you kind of obsessed so that you spend more time on these apps. But they, of course, also could be overcommitted to their roles, right? In sincerity, there was also a lot of overcommitment to one's roles, which led to all kinds of pathologies. You can over-identify with your role as whatever mother or father in a patriarchalic society. And you can also, in Chinese context, very much over-identify with your role as a dutiful daughter or dutiful son. And this leads to all kinds of pathologies there. You can be over-identified with your national identification, with sincere commitment to whatever, being a Serb or something like this. And of course, you can also be completely obsessed with your pursuit of originality, right? Which a lot of people are, who like kind of pathologically narcissistic, if we might say. So in today's neoliberal and hyper-capitalist world, obviously profiles lend themselves to extreme commodification and exhibition. And I was already mentioning social media and the pressure that is put on you to constantly engage in this profile work. And especially, I don't have a slide here on this, but the American social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, he showed that there's basically a huge rise in teenage depression and teenage suicide in America among teenage girls, and that correlates with Instagram use. So that is a kind of a sign how profile building for teenagers can be a very kind of challenging task that they often cannot cope with. And of course, profile building can and is instrumentalized for ideological agendas. And as I said, this is, I think, also the case for gender profiles and particularly transgender profiles. So I think it's important in the end to avoid overinvestment into one's profile or into one's identity in general. And to remain at ease, again, this is what Masha Gessen says at the very end of the clip that was played at the beginning of the presentation. Trying just, a playful approach to identity, to maintain some form of ease with regard to one's identity. In general, no matter which identity technology one applies. And that, of course, also includes one's gender identity or one's sexual orientation. So somehow to build a kind of immunity or a capacity to resist the pressures of overinvestment in building one's identity. Yes, and I think that is already the final slide. Yes, that's already the final slide. Which picture is nice? Maybe this one. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Georg, for your interesting presentation. So now I'm opening the floor for questions, comments, suggestions, etc. So who would like to start? Would anyone like to? Georgie, then Milica after that.
So, for this lecture, it was really kind of distilled everything, your theory of prophelicity in a nice way. I have a question. You said, actually I have two questions, if that's okay. The first one concerns these distinctions between sincerity, authenticity, and prophelicity. And it seems to me that the way you presented authenticity relates more to this individual, solipsistic, monological search for originality, while prophelicity is much more interpersonal. And my question is, isn't this distinction, I mean, we could say, for example, if we take the theory of recognition in Hegel, and we find there this interpersonal building of identity, but I would say we could map him onto, he's still in the age of sincerity, let's say. But you mentioned Charles Taylor, and for him, authenticity and interpersonal identity building go hand in hand. So there is, I would say, also in authenticity, we could, of course, there are, I would say, maybe the mainstream, how we understand authenticity is this kind of a monological search for my original self. But in different theories, such as in Charles Taylor's, authenticity is actually interpersonally built through mutual recognition, which brings it much closer to this kind of interpersonal model of prophelicity. And the second question is, you said that we shouldn't over-invest ourselves in our profiles, and I understand that, but you also said then we shouldn't over-invest ourselves in our sincere commitments. So, for example, you gave the Chinese example, but isn't sincerity, in a sense, the pathology doesn't come from over-investment, it comes from when you lose this investment. It's kind of a, isn't it built into sincerity in this traditional role model that you are, in a sense, already over-invested. You don't have other options presented to you. You don't even search for other options. This investments that you have is the one that you are assigned, and pathologies would emerge actually when this when there is this break, or let's say this distance between you and your own socially constructed identity, which is then much more typical for authenticity and prophelicity, of course. There is this kind of a large gap between myself, my constructed identity, and let's say whatever is myself, which is not invested in the profile. There is this gap, but I would say that for traditional societies, for that you termed the age of sincerity, I would say overinvestment wouldn't be an issue. It's actually underinvestment would be an issue for such a society. If you understand what I wish to say. Those are my two questions. Thank you.
These are both very good questions. Thank you for bringing up these points. The first point, you're 100% right. I 100% agree with you. Actually, in the book, I'm have a section, Hegel as the first philosopher of authenticity. And not the first, but like his important philosopher of authenticity. You're precisely right, right? In authenticity, we're looking for recognition by another authentic self. It's looking for mutual recognition. Like the common term I use for this is like soulmates, right? You're looking for your soulmate, and then you mutually recognize one another. And you can only build kind of true authenticity through this process of mutual recognition. So that is perfectly right. But again, like in the end, it's about discovering your true self, basically, or creating your true self, or how to say, improving your self-consciousness in the Hegelian sense. So it's a mutual effort, but it's about increasing subjectivity and autonomy, to use the Kantian term. But you do it with your soulmates. So yes, I completely acknowledge that, let's say, social dimension to authenticity as well, which is also why one reason why I don't really use the term individualism that much. So you're absolutely right about the first point. Second point is also interesting and very important. This whole kind of conceptual framework, and particularly the sincerity framework, for me personally, was developed out of my study of Chinese philosophy. That's my background. And Confucianism, Chinese, still until today the most important philosophical school in China, is very strong sincerity culture. And there's a very strong regime of sincerity. I mentioned this very briefly in the presentation, especially on children, that you have to be devoted to your parents, commit to your parents, right? And commit to your role as a dutiful child, dutiful daughter, dutiful son. And it's still extremely strong in Chinese society until today. Now, I studied Taoism, and that's my emphasis with Paul D'Ambrosio. And our understanding of Taoism is basically that it is a philosophy that is developed as a reaction against the pathologies in Confucianism, the pathologies from over-committing to your family roles. And it has been misinterpreted, we think, that's the main argument of our book, as a philosophy of authenticity and as a philosophy of individualism, Taoism. But it's not. It's a philosophy that kind of tries to, it's a therapeutic philosophy that tries to prevent people from this overinvestment. As you said, in a sincerity culture basically asks for overinvestment. More and more investment. Religious is the same thing, right? Religion is usually, like in the Western context, very also sincerity, right? You're constantly forced to kind of be overinvesting in your religious commitment. And Taoism is basically a philosophy that tries to enable people to take their self less seriously. It advocates something like, no self. And that basically means kind of a decrease of your investment in your identity, of your commitment to a specific identity. And it notices this, as you said, this very strong tendency in a strong sincerity culture, where basically this overcommitment becomes endemic and becomes basically the root cause, although I hate this word, for all kinds of psychological, mental, and social pathologies. And again, I would point, for instance, to Nietzsche as a similar. In many ways, Nietzsche and Taoism have some similar things. Nietzsche's analysis of his criticism of Christianity, I think, has many parallels to Taoism, in that it also shows kind of the pathologies that emerge in this case, a religious culture that emphasizes sincerity very strongly.
So thank you very much for this lecture. I would like to ask, what do you think about political dimension of prophelicity? And by political dimension, I mean political in some narrow sense, because we are all aware that the anti-gender movement and anti-gender campaigns are becoming more and more popular worldwide, and that gender is now basically presented in a lot of populist movements or by a right-wing politician as the greatest threats of our time. So do you think that we as intellectuals, when we try to step out our academic sphere and enter public sphere and public debate, do we find prophelicity useful also not just in theory, but in that kind of context?
Yeah, I think that politics have also become largely profile politics. And that is also problematic. So it basically has taken on some form of religious nature. And it prevents often critical reflections on things. So that's why I pointed to this German law text and all the internal contradictions. So we see like these attempts that you pointed out, both on the left and on the right, to basically use gender in order to promote a certain political agenda. Yeah, I think that is philosophically quite problematic because it confuses all kinds of it confuses all these. It confuses an understanding of what gender actually is, and my point is to try to clarify this confusion, or at least some of this confusion. So, in short, I think this let's say political appropriation of the gender debate for profiling reasons is something that we as philosophers should be more critical of, and maybe resist the pressures that we have that are on us to profile ourselves in line with whatever may be expected from us. I don't know if I understand what you mean.
I was thinking when you were mentioning the three modes of identity, what they actually mean, or what they encompass, the sincere, the authentic, and the prophilic mode of identity. And you have talked about the ways in which these modalities of identity function basically as methodologies of subjectivation. But that is different from how they function at the level of second order consciousness. So when I'm performing a sincere gender identity in a traditional society, I'm not basically on a level of self-reflexivity saying to myself, I'm performing this role of woman sincerely. I'm saying to myself, I'm realizing my generic and transhistorical essence of being a woman, right? When it comes to authenticity, also, yes, as a technology of subjectivation, it means basically creating a sense of originality. But what I say to myself at the level of second order consciousness is I'm discovering my true self and trying to express my true self. So there's also a strong metaphysical element there. Now, when it comes to prophelicity, what is unique about it and also challenging is that it basically erases, I would say, this distinction between what is an objective technology of subjectivation and a self-reflexive way of self-relating, because also at the level of second-order consciousness, we are basically saying to ourselves, yes, we are curating our profiles. So what it requires from us is that we are post-metaphysical thinkers at the level of our self-reflexivity. And this is something that we haven't yet reached, I would say, as society, at least not in large numbers. And I would say this is why the language of authenticity persists. It's not just some futile attempt to save authenticity. It's also a way of coping with this non-existent post-metaphysical consciousness. And in that context, I would just ask, how do you see the role of engaged social scientists or theorists because there seems to be a circularity there. It's the practice of prophilicity that should create its own presuppositions. It is through this practice that we evolve a sense of post-metaphysical self-relation, but then it also presupposes that we already have this kind of self-relation. And how do we get out of this circularity?
Yes. These are excellent points. I couldn't agree more. I mean, you expressed better than I this point. So again, I 100% agree. Very acute observation. And just as a footnote to this, yeah, we don't really have the vocabulary yet for describing ourselves in these, let's say, post-metaphysical terms. And we still only have the vocabulary, the conceptual vocabulary of the age of authenticity and of the age of sincerity, and that is a problem. We have maybe some vocabulary, but that's too esoteric by postmodernists, like whatever Derrida and Baudrillard. So they provided a certain vocabulary, but that hasn't become like that hasn't kind of trickled down. So. I think practically most people actually reach that level that you describe, that we are aware that we are creating profiles. But even though it's something that is very common and it doesn't, require much intellectual effort or so, it's something especially younger people grow up with, so to speak, naturally. But as a society and as social scientists, we haven't really developed an adequate vocabulary, interestingly enough, for that yet. Again, like another source for this would maybe be whatever, like Nietzsche, right? I mean, who talked about, the Übermensch, the overman. Somehow we moved already to this kind of post age of authenticity, new kind of existential level. But again, we still describe ourselves, as you said, in the terms of authenticity or even sincerity. So yeah, excellent point. And maybe I would, of course, be glad if somehow philosophy and social sciences could somehow develop a conceptual vocabulary that would be more adequate for our current existential situation. And again, to go back to the previous question, I think one of the reasons why we're not really doing this is because we're still stuck into these in these kind of rather meaningless ideological debates that where neither side operates with a very adequate conceptualization of identity. We are in an age of identity politics, but our capability of conceptualizing identity lags behind.
Okay, anyone else? We had some very interesting questions. So, does anyone else have a comment? So maybe I will maybe I have some questions. So it seems to me that when you talk about the pathologies of different identity technologies, it seems to me that your, if you can call it a prescription to ward off these pathologies, is always to be careful not to invest ourselves too much in our identities. But could we say that maybe prophilicity has does it have already in itself build in some of this kind of distance towards our identity, since we are objectivizing our identity as a profile, while others, while the two previous technologies have this metaphysical, as Marian said, the idea of a metaphysical essence. So could we say that in a sense we need to be careful not to invest too much in our profiles, but actually what you're recommending is to, in a way, embrace this ironic distance that prophilicity has built in already?
Yes. Also, very good point, Milan. Also, I fully agree, but I'd like to add, it has both kind of, for exactly the reasons you pointed out, the potential for not taking oneself too seriously, more so than also the previous commenter said, the more metaphysically inclined identity technologies. But at the same time, it's also, as we specifically see with the teenagers, and as we probably see with our own addiction every day to social media and so forth, that it at the same time also somehow poses the greatest dangers, because so it's both. It both has the highest potential for developing, as Masha Gessen says, a playful attitude to one's identity, but it also has the highest potential to take this game too seriously and to become addicted to this game. And then the game, the playfulness easily, right? That's also with games. If you get like sucked too deeply into a game, then the game can become very dangerous as well.
Okay then, thank you. So are there any more questions, comments? No. Okay then, thank you everyone, and thank you Professor Moeller for this great lecture and even better discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.